The history of the American West is frequently reduced to a monolithic narrative of Anglo-expansion, a mythology constructed of dime novels and silver screen fabrications. However, the true history of the frontier, particularly within the jurisdictional anomaly known as the Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma, is a complex tapestry of displaced indigenous nations, freedmen, fugitives, and federal authority. At the center of this turbulent intersection stands Bass Reeves. To understand the lawman, one must first confront the enslaved man. Bass Reeves was born in July 1838 in Crawford County, Arkansas, into the chattel slavery system of the antebellum South. He was the property of William Steele Reeves, a farmer and Arkansas state legislator. This initial geographic placement is significant. Reeves was born on the very edge of the frontier near Van Buren, Arkansas, ironically the precise region he would later patrol as a symbol of federal power. Unlike the deep plantation economy of the Mississippi Delta, the slavery of the Arkansas uplands and North Texas was often characterized by a different, though no less brutal dynamic of labor. The terrain was rugged, the population sparse, and the isolation profound. In 1846, William Reeves relocated his operation and his human property to Grayson County, Texas. This migration moved the 8-year-old Bass from the Ozark foothills to the precipice of the Great Plains. It was here, in the harsh, unforgiving environment of North Texas, that the boy grew into a man of imposing physical stature. Standing 6 feet, 2 inches tall and weighing approximately 180 to 200 pounds, Reeves possessed a physicality that would later become part of his legend. In an era where nutrition was poor and the average height for men hovered around 5 feet 7 inches, Reeves was a giant. However, his value to the Reeves family extended beyond mere field labor. He developed a reputation for a good manner, high intelligence, and a sense of humor, traits that led William's son, Colonel George R. Reeves, to select Bass as his personal body servant, valet, and bodyguard. This proximity to George Reeves placed Bass in a unique, albeit subjugated, position. He was not merely a field hand, he was a companion in the hunt and a shadow to the master. It was during these years in Texas that Bass began to hone the skills that would define his later career. He became an expert marksman with both pistol and rifle. Historical accounts suggest that despite his enslavement, his skill was such that he was eventually barred from local turkey shooting competitions because his victory was considered a foregone conclusion. He became ambidextrous with firearms, a tactical advantage that would save his life repeatedly in the decades to come. When the American Civil War erupted in 1861, the fault lines of the nation split not just states, but households. George Reeves, a staunch secessionist and member of the Texas legislature, organized a cavalry regiment for Grayson County, the 11th Texas Cavalry, and joined the Confederate Army. Bass was forced to accompany him. This dynamic, an enslaved man armed and riding alongside his enslaver into battle, was a common, if paradoxical, practice among Confederate officers. Bass likely witnessed the battles of Chattanooga, Chickamauga, and the Atlanta Campaign, absorbing the brutal realities of guerrilla warfare and large-scale combat. He saw the carnage of 19th-century warfare firsthand, an education in violence that no law enforcement training could replicate. However, the war brought the tensions between master and enslaved servant to a breaking point. The specific catalyst for Bass Reeves's escape is a subject of historical convergence around a single, violent event. Family oral history and historical accounts indicate that sometime between 1861 and 1862, a dispute arose over a card game. The card game narrative is deceptively simple. In the context of the master-slave hierarchy, a card game implies a suspension of social rules, a momentary equality. When an argument broke out, Bass Reeves did the unthinkable. He struck George Reeves. Some accounts suggest he beat him within an inch of his life. In the Confederacy, striking a white man, let alone a master and a military officer, was a capital offense. It was an act of definitive rebellion, a crossing of the Rubicon from which there was no return. Bass Reeves did not wait for the inevitable retribution. He fled immediately, abandoning the Confederate lines. He did not run toward the Union lines in the east, where he might be returned or pressed into labor battalions, but rather toward the lawless vacuum of the Indian Territory. He was now a fugitive twice over, a runaway slave and a man who had assaulted a Confederate colonel. Bass Reeves crossed the Red River, leaving Texas and the jurisdiction of the Confederacy behind, plunging into the Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma. At this time, the territory was a complex geopolitical entity, a nation within a nation, that operated under a unique set of treaties and legal frameworks. It was the domain of the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Muskogee, and Seminole, who had been forcibly relocated there during the Trail of Tears decades prior. The territory was not merely a refuge. It was a foreign country with its own laws, languages, and customs. It was also a sanctuary for the desperate. Because the tribes had their own governments and police, but no jurisdiction over white or black U.S. citizens, the region had become a haven for the worst of the worst: horse thieves, murderers, and fugitives from American justice who used the jurisdictional gaps to operate with impunity. The treaties of 1866 would later complicate this, but during the Civil War, the territory was a chaotic buffer zone, with tribes themselves split between Union and Confederate allegiances. Reeves, however, did not join the criminal element. He sought refuge among the tribes themselves. He lived primarily with the Creek and Seminole nations, and also spent time with the Cherokee. This period of exile was the crucible that forged the future Marshal. He did not merely survive, he assimilated. He learned the topography of the land, the winding rivers, the caves of the Boston Mountains, the dense thickets of the blackjack oaks, and the treacherous currents of the Arkansas and Canadian rivers. More importantly, he learned the people. He mastered the Creek, Seminole, and Cherokee languages. He learned their customs, their social hierarchies, and their methods of tracking. The Seminole and Creek, who had their own history of resistance and integration with runaway slaves, black Seminoles, likely provided a hospitable, if cautious, environment for a man of Reeves's capabilities. During this lost period, Reeves perfected his skills with the pistol and rifle. Unlike the structured drills of the Confederate cavalry, he learned the fluid, instinctual shooting required for survival in the brush. He became a tracker of superhuman ability, able to read the disturbed earth, the flight of birds, and the broken twig. He transformed from a fugitive running away from something into a man who was becoming part of the land. He learned to become invisible, a skill that would define his later methodology. But the story of what he specifically learned and how he applied the deep, esoteric knowledge of the tribes to his later work remains the untold secret of his success. It is here that we must pause. The fugitive is deep in the brush, the Civil War is raging to the east, and Bass Reeves is waiting. The conclusion of the Civil War and the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 legally freed Bass Reeves. No longer a fugitive, he emerged from the Indian Territory and returned to Arkansas. He purchased land near Van Buren, became a successful farmer, and married Nellie Jenny, sometimes referred to as Jenny, with whom he would eventually have 11 children. For a decade, he lived the life of a quiet, prosperous freedman, seemingly content to leave the violence of his past behind. However, the chaos of the Indian Territory had only intensified. The region was, as described by contemporary accounts, saturated with horse thieves, cattle rustlers, gunslingers, bandits, bootleggers, swindlers, and murderers. The tribal courts had no jurisdiction over non-citizens, and the federal presence was anemic. The United States Court for the Western District of Arkansas, located in Fort Smith, held jurisdiction over this vast expanse. Geographically, this jurisdiction was immense, covering over 75,000 square miles. It was bounded by the Arkansas state line to the east, the imposition of the Texas Panhandle to the west, Kansas to the north, and the Red River to the south. This no man's land was a graveyard for deputies and a paradise for outlaws. In 1875, President Ulysses S. Grant sought to impose order on this anarchy. He appointed Isaac C. Parker as the federal judge for the Western District of Arkansas. Parker, who would gain infamy as the hanging judge, arrived in Fort Smith with a mandate to clean up the territory. His jurisdiction was vast, and his tool for enforcement was the U.S. Marshal Service. Parker was a complex figure. While known for his high number of executions, he was also a reformer who believed in the rule of law and the protection of the chaotic territory's indigenous inhabitants from white encroachment. Judge Parker appointed James F. Fagan as the U.S. Marshal and authorized him to hire 200 deputies. Fagan faced a logistical nightmare. He needed men who could ride, shoot, track, and, crucially, navigate the complex cultural and linguistic landscape of the Indian Territory. White deputies often struggled with the tribal languages and were viewed with deep suspicion by the Native American population. They were outsiders in a land that required insider knowledge to survive. Fagan had heard of the freedman farmer near Van Buren who knew the territory better than any mapmaker and spoke the languages of the Creek and Seminole like a native. In 1875, James Fagan recruited Bass Reeves. Bass Reeves's commissioning was historic. He was the first black Deputy U.S. Marshal to serve west of the Mississippi River. This appointment was not a token gesture, it was a pragmatic necessity born of the unique demographics of the frontier. In the racial hierarchy of the post-Reconstruction South, a black man arresting white men was a radical disruption of social norms. However, in the Indian Territory, the dynamics were different. To the Creek, Cherokee, and Seminole, a black deputy was often preferable to a white one, as freedmen did not carry the same history of treaty violation and encroachment as white settlers. Reeves occupied a liminal space, able to move between the worlds of the white federal government, the black freedmen communities, and the tribal nations with a fluidity that no other deputy could match. Reeves took the oath of office and pinned the star to his vest. There was, however, a significant hurdle. Reeves was illiterate, a legacy of his enslaved upbringing. He could not read the writs and warrants he was sworn to serve. To overcome this, Reeves developed a cognitive system that demonstrated his extraordinary memory. He would have someone read the warrants to him before he left Fort Smith. He would memorize the shapes of the names and the specific charges, associating them with the physical descriptions of the outlaws. He would categorize them in his mind, this subpoena for the left pocket, that warrant for the right. In a career spanning 32 years, he never arrested the wrong man due to this disability. The life of a Deputy U.S. Marshal was not one of glamorous duels. It was a grueling war of attrition against geography and desperate men. Reeves would depart Fort Smith with a posse wagon, a chuck wagon driven by a cook and a guard. These expeditions could last months, covering a circuit of over 800 miles round trip. The deputies were paid in fees, not a salary. They received a specific amount for serving a warrant, a specific amount for mileage, and a specific amount for an arrest. If they failed to catch their man, they were often out of pocket for the expenses of the trip. This system incentivized success, but also efficiency. Reeves's strategy was methodical. He did not simply chase outlaws, he hunted them. He was known to carry 2 Colt peacemakers, butt forward for a cross draw, and a Winchester rifle, which he preferred for its range and accuracy. He rode a large horse, often described as a sorrel or a white horse depending on the period, imposing a terrifying silhouette. One of the most exhaustive manhunts in Reeves' career was the pursuit of Bob Dozier. Dozier was a jack-of-all-trades criminal, a cattle rustler, bank robber, land swindler, and murderer who had evaded capture for years. He was known for his unpredictability, his network of spies, and his refusal to be taken alive. Reeves tracked Dozier for months, a game of cat and mouse that moved through the Cherokee Hills. The climax of this pursuit occurred on December 20th, 1878. Tracking Dozier into a dense storm, the conditions were apocalyptic: mud, rain, and near-zero visibility. The physical toll of such a chase cannot be overstated. Sleeping in the wet, eating cold rations, and maintaining constant vigilance against ambush. Reeves and a posse member set up camp, anticipating a miserable night. Suddenly, a bullet whistled past Reeves's head. Dozier had circled back, hunting the hunter. Reeves dove for cover. He saw a shadow moving in the tree line. Dozier, laughing, believing he had killed the famous lawman. Reeves, lying in the mud, spotted the outlaw. He ordered Dozier to drop his gun. Dozier instead crouched to fire his rifle. Reeves, whose reflexes were legendary, fired first. His bullet struck Dozier in the neck, killing him instantly. Reeves later cited this as the highlight of his career, not for the kill, but for the culmination of the hunt. If Dozier was the cunning prey, Jim Webb was the apex predator. Webb was a ranch foreman turned outlaw with 11 notches on his gun. Reeves had arrested him once, but Webb had made bail and skipped town, returning to the outlaw life with a vengeance. Reeves tracked Webb to Bywater's store near the Sacred Heart Mission in the Chickasaw Nation. As Reeves approached, Webb spotted him and sprinted for his horse, armed with a revolver and a Winchester. A running gunfight ensued. Webb turned in the saddle, firing at Reeves. His bullets grazed Reeves's saddle horn, cut a button off his coat, and shot the reins out of his hands. Reeves, riding hard and now guiding his horse with his knees, returned fire with his Winchester. At a distance of 500 yards, a staggering range for the firearms of the era, suggesting either exaggeration by witnesses or miraculous shot by Reeves, Reeves fired. The bullet struck Webb, knocking him from his horse. As Reeves approached the dying outlaw, Webb recognized his superior. In a moment of grim professional courtesy, Webb handed Reeves his revolver. "You are a brave man," Webb reportedly said. "I want you to accept my revolver, for with it I have killed 11 men, and I expected you to make the 12th. This interaction highlights a peculiar code of honor that existed between the lawman and the bad man of the territory, a mutual recognition of skill that transcended the law itself. Reeves's success was not solely due to ballistics. It was due to his intellect and his ability to manipulate the social expectations of his targets. He was a master of disguise. He utilized his race and the prejudices of the outlaws against them. White criminals rarely suspected a solitary, disheveled black man of being a federal officer. The most famous instance of this is the letter trick, sometimes conflated with the capture of the 2 Texan outlaws. Tracking 2 murderers near the Red River, Reeves determined that a direct assault on their cabin would be suicidal. Instead, he shot holes in his own hat, roughed up his clothes, and walked to the house on foot, posing as a fugitive on the run from a posse. He told the woman at the house that he was being pursued, and showed them the bullet holes in his hat as proof. The outlaws, believing they had found a kindred spirit, a fellow desperate man on the run, invited him in. Reeves played the role perfectly, sharing food and stories. As night fell, the outlaws went to sleep, leaving their fellow fugitive unrestrained. Reeves waited until they were snoring, then handcuffed them in their sleep. When they awoke, the fugitive was standing over them with a drawn Colt, revealing himself as Deputy U.S. Marshal Bass Reeves. He marched them 28 miles back to his camp, the outlaws cursing him the entire way. This incident reveals a critical insight. Reeves weaponized the invisibility of the black man in the West. By playing the role of the downtrodden, helpless fugitive, he exploited the outlaws' racial underestimation of him, turning their prejudice into their prison. Reeves was not immune to the violence he policed, nor was he above the scrutiny of the law he enforced. In 1884, while in the Chickasaw Nation, Reeves shot and killed his camp cook, William Leach. The circumstances were tragic and murky. Accounts suggest a gun was discharged while Reeves was cleaning it, or possibly during a moment of banter where Reeves was joking about Leach's cooking. The bullet struck Leach in the neck, killing him. Reeves, the man of the law, was now a killer in the eyes of the court. He was indicted for murder. This was a moment of supreme peril. Despite his badge, he was a black man facing a murder charge in the South, even if that South was the federal enclave of Fort Smith. However, Reeves did not flee. He surrendered, posted a $3,000 bond, and stood trial in 1887 before Judge Parker. He was defended by W.H.H. Clayton, a former U.S. attorney and friend. The trial was a spectacle, but Reeves's reputation for honesty and the testimony of witnesses confirming the accidental nature of the shooting led to his acquittal. The verdict affirmed his integrity, but the incident left a permanent shadow on his career, a reminder of the lethal volatility of his trade. It demonstrated that even the invincible Marshal was subject to the fragility of life and the cold mechanics of the justice system. The ultimate test of Bass Reeves's adherence to the law came in 1902. His son, Benjamin "Benny" Reeves, was charged with the murder of his wife, Castella Brown. Benny had caught Castella in an infidelity when she was unapologetic, stating she thought more of her lover's little finger than she did of whole body. He shot her in a fit of rage. The warrant for Benny Reeves landed on the desk of the U.S. Marshal in Muskogee. The other deputies were hesitant to take it, fearing the reaction of Bass Reeves. Arresting the son of a legend was a task no one wanted. When Bass heard of the warrant, he did not ask for leniency. He demanded the warrant for himself. He reportedly stated, "Give me the writ." The manhunt for his own son was brief but emotionally devastating. Accounts vary on the capture. Some say Benny surrendered immediately when he saw his father. Others say Bass tracked him to a trestle near Muskogee and ambushed him. Still others say he found him at a house and called him out. "You can come out with your hands up, or your whole body will be down." Regardless of the mechanics, the result was the same. Bass Reeves arrested his son, handcuffed him, and transported him to jail. Benny was tried, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison at Leavenworth, later commuted to a lesser term after which he lived a quiet life. This act stands as the defining moment of Reeves's moral code. He placed the abstract concept of the law above the primal instinct of family. It solidified his reputation as incorruptible, but at a terrible personal cost, alienating him from parts of his family and serving as a tragic capstone to his career. As the 19th century waned, the unique world of the Indian Territory began to collapse. The push for Oklahoma statehood brought new laws and a new social order. The federal dominance of the U.S. Marshals was replaced by local sheriffs and police departments. Crucially, the encroaching shadow of Jim Crow laws began to strip away the authority of black lawmen. The Reconstruction era, which had allowed a man like Reeves to flourish, was being dismantled. In 1907, Oklahoma became a state. The Federal Marshal Service was reorganized. Bass Reeves, now nearly 70 years old, was discharged. The era of the invincible Marshal riding the open range was over. We return now to the fugitive in the brush during the Civil War. We left Bass Reeves learning the ways of the Creek and Seminole. We can now fully appreciate how this period of exile was not a pause in his life, but the foundation of it. While living with the tribes, Reeves did not just learn to shoot, he learned to see. He internalized the geography of the Indian Territory, the very 75,000 square miles he would later police. He learned the location of the hidden springs, the rock shelters in the Sandboy Mountains, and the crossings of the Canadian River. When he later hunted men like Bob Dozier or the Brunters, he was not navigating a map. He was moving through his own backyard. He learned the pharmacological knowledge of the tribes, how to treat wounds with local flora, how to find food when the chuck wagon was empty. This allowed him to stay on the trail longer than any white deputy who relied on supply lines. Crucially, he learned the social fabric of the nations. He understood the internal politics of the Creek and Cherokee factions. He knew who was sheltering whom. When he pinned on the badge in 1875, he was not an outsider imposing law, he was an insider enforcing it. His untold history, The years of living as an Indian in all but blood was the secret weapon that allowed him to arrest 3,000 men without ever being shot. The fugitive had become the ultimate tracker because he knew exactly what it felt like to run. After his dismissal from the Marshal service in 1907 due to statehood, Reeves did not retire to a rocking chair. He joined the Muskogee Police Department as a beat officer. It was a steep step down from the roaming power of a Deputy U.S. Marshal, but he needed the work, and he knew no other life. Even at age 69, walking with a cane, his reputation was so formidable that crime on his beat reportedly vanished. He patrolled the streets of Muskogee for 2 years. However, his health began to fail. He was diagnosed with Bright's disease, nephritis. On January 12, 1910, Bass Reeves died. He was 71 years old. In the years following his death, Bass Reeves faded into obscurity, a victim of the whitewashing of Western history. It is often speculated, though never definitively proven, that Reeves was the inspiration for the Lone Ranger character, a lawman on a white horse fighting injustice in the West, often associated with Indian territory. The parallels are striking: the silver dollars he gave out, the white horse, the many disguises, the companion roles. Whether or not he was the fictional mask's origin, the factual reality is far more compelling. Bass Reeves arrested over 3,000 felons. He killed 14 men in the line of duty, never initiating the violence but always ending it. He arrested his own minister for selling illegal whiskey, and he arrested his own son for murder. He walked out of the chains of slavery, survived the fires of the Civil War, mastered the wilderness of the Indian nations, and brought law to the most dangerous square mileage in America. He was not merely a black lawman. He was the definition of the American frontier hero, stripped of myth and forged in iron.